This is the untold story of the making of the modern world. A fresh perspective, charting the spread of civilization across the globe. From the dawn of mankind and the first cities and empires, to the belief in one God. We follow the flow of civilization from the Middle East, an extraordinary place that has been a vital link between the continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe for millennia. An economic, scientific, and cultural center of the world. This is an epic journey of discovery. From the east to the west. Conquest Day, commemorated throughout Turkey every year. It recreates a historic event in 1453, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. At its heart is a heroic figure, the Ottoman Sultan. This is the moment he earned his name, Mehmet the Conqueror. The arrival of the Ottomans marked the end of a millennium of Christian Byzantine rule and the beginning of a new world order.
When Mehmet came in here, he knew he'd achieved his ultimate ambition. He had smashed the Byzantine Empire.
This dynamic new dynasty would rapidly evolve into a sophisticated Renaissance superpower that would inspire both fear and fascination in the West.
Ne Avrupa'yı Osmanlı olmadan anlayabilirsiniz, ne Osmanlı'yı Avrupa olmadan anlayabilirsiniz. Birbirini var eden iki entiteden bahsediyoruz.
The Ottomans would create models for state, trade, and culture.
Even today, you get a feeling for the permanency of this dynasty that ruled half the known world for more than half a millennium.
This is the story of the rise of the Ottoman Empire. "600 years ago, the Islamic world was fractured. The Mongols had stormed across from Central Asia, creating a new order. Gone were the old sultanates. Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, was a patchwork of beyliks, small states run by different family regimes. But one of these had greater ambitions. Ruled by a dynasty that would found one of the largest and longest-lasting empires in history, the Ottomans. Settled on the northwestern slopes of Mount Uludağ is the first capital of the Ottoman state, Bursa. In the 14th century, the Ottoman Beylik was rapidly expanding within Anatolia, but they wanted more. Tucked away in Bursa today is a special place that marks where the Ottoman story began. This tomb belongs to the founder of the Ottoman Empire, the man who gave his name to the dynasty, Osman.
The tomb of Osman Gazi. No more fitting place to begin talking about the Ottomans than the tomb of the founder of what was to become a 600-year dynasty, Osman.
We don't know much about Osman's life. He remains a mysterious figure.
Myth has it that he was a shepherd who was also a very successful military leader. He was obviously charismatic because people were attracted to his banner. But between the years of 1302 and his death in 1324, he laid the foundations for what was to become the Ottoman state.
The Ottomans captured Bursa from the Byzantines in 1326. Osman's tomb was built on the site of a church complex, the center of the old Byzantine city the Ottomans had conquered. These sarcophagi are ceremonial markers commemorating the resting place of Osman and his family.
We know that his son, Orhan, buried him here in probably one of the most prominent spots of Bursa, the first city that the Ottomans took. Next to him are buried a number of his family members. All around the interior of the tomb are buried, I think, about 15 of his family members.
For 600 years, this became a central point of pilgrimage as people came here to pay homage to the founder of the dynasty.
There's no way that today one can get the entire feeling of what this tomb was once like, because there should be probably 50 or 70 people praying with candles. But even today, you get a feeling for the permanency of this dynasty.
We may not know much about Osman's rule, but we do know he reputedly had a famous dream. A dream that has become the foundation myth of the Ottoman Empire.
He's spending the night in the village home of a sheikh named Edebali, and he has this dream about this giant tree growing out of his navel. And Edebali, who is a holy man, explains to him that that tree is his lineage, what's going to happen in the future, and that he might be well advised to marry Edebali's daughter, who would help that foundation myth become reality.
Osman married Sheikh Edebali's daughter and sowed the seeds of the Ottoman dynasty.
Ağaç sakin olmayı, sükunete ermeyi ve kök salmayı işaret eder. Artık özellikle Anadolu'da yerleşmek, kök salmak, sükunete ermek ve sakin olmak istiyorlar. Bir diğer özellik ise ağacın dallarının bütün dünyaya yayılması da bir emperyal ideolojiyi imliyor, işaret ediyor. Dolayısıyla Osmanlı rüyasında iki işlem birlikte düşünülür. Bir, Türklerin yerleşmesi, iki, dünya hakimiyeti fikri.
Ottoman power passed down from generation to generation, creating a strong and lasting lineage. By the 14th century, the Ottomans were dominating Anatolia, and they built permanent foundations here in Bursa.
It's really hard to overstress the importance of Bursa. This is where the Ottoman Empire really begins, and it remained an extremely important center of Ottoman history. This is literally where it all began.
Ulu Mosque was the central point in this quintessential early Ottoman city. The skyline of Bursa today is adorned with minarets and domes, evidence of the Ottomans' talent for city building.
Here you really have the heart of an Ottoman city. This is probably the best surviving example. You have the central Friday Mosque, whose minaret I'm standing atop, surrounded by all of the buildings that are key to really understanding what an Ottoman city was all about. This particular mosque is built in 1399. And a series of structures were built around it to provide, among other things, income for its upkeep and maintenance. And they included primarily a series of huge khans, central marketplaces, sometimes called kervansarais, one of which is here the Koza Khan. And it is one of a series of 6 similar khans that are built around the perimeter of this mosque. And then in the center, now full of trees, it would have been open, and merchants would actually bring their camel caravans of goods into a particular khan. In the case of this one, it was used for the silk trade. Bursa was a hub of commerce with goods coming from the east as far as Yemen, spices coming overland, silk coming from Syria and Iran, Persia, and it is really no exaggeration to say that the city was built on silk. So even as they were constantly moving westward, the Ottomans were also very interested in and spent a lot of time and effort developing trade and commerce.
Its strategic location on the westernmost end of the famous Silk Route made Bursa one of the most important trading posts in Anatolia. The Ottomans used the revenue from trade to build in style. Bursa rapidly expanded until the new Ottoman city spread miles beyond the old Byzantine city walls. In Bursa, the legacy of the Ottoman Turks is carved in its buildings.
The message that these buildings give to me is one of permanence. It's as if the Ottomans were saying to the peoples they conquered by the creation of these new built environments, oh, by the way, we're here to stay. They didn't have the need to live behind walled cities. They didn't feel the need. So when I look at this panorama, it all spells permanence.
The Ottomans transformed Bursa into a staging post for a new world empire. The Ottoman advance was rapid. Ravaged by centuries of isolation, plague, and war, the Byzantine capital was surrounded by Ottoman forces. Control of this strategic location was essential. As a bridge into the Balkans, it would unify Ottoman territory in both Europe and Asia and give the new Ottoman state international status. This huge Christian metropolis, known then simply as the city, had been founded 1,000 years earlier by the Roman Emperor Constantine. It controlled the straits where Asia and Europe meet. It had seen far greater days, but was still a daunting prize. The dream of a great Ottoman empire would be realized by one extraordinary man, the direct descendant of Osman, Sultan Mehmet II. In 1453, Mehmet was just 21 years old. His entire life had been a preparation for this moment. Over 100 specially built Ottoman warships lay at anchor in the Marmara Sea and waited. On land, Mehmet mustered a 100,000-strong force, led by his own household troops, the Janissaries. Armourers and engineers wheeled enormous cannon and siege machines into position. Their target, the walls of Constantinople. Inside the walls, the Byzantines were a meagre force, reliant on the strength of their city's defences.
These walls are absolutely wonderful. Down this way, you can see them dropping down towards the Golden Horn. Up this way, you can see the magnificent land walls. They stride away into the distance, and they look like they could protect Constantinople almost forever. But there's a catch, and the catch is the higher ground that you can see behind the modern road, and that is the Achilles heel, is a place where the Ottomans could put their cannon. And a bit of elevation would allow them to really pick on this section of the walls. This was the weakest part of the city's defences. That meant the Christian defenders had to base their best troops here.
II. Mehmet bu son derece güçlü ordusuyla şehrin surlarını tamamen kuşattı. Tabii burada asıl önemli olan topların durumudur. O dönemde özellikle üçgen veya dörtgen şeklinde hedefler belirlenmişti. Bir köşesine, daha sonra diğer köşeye, ardından da üçüncü köşeye atış yaparak bu bölgeyi yumuşatıyorlar ve sonradan büyük topun güllesiyle birlikte ortaya isabet ettiriliyor ve sonra bu kısım, tabii yumuşayan bu kısım olduğu gibi çökertiliyor orada aşağıya doğru.
I think it's kind of hard to imagine what it's like to be somewhere for 40 odd days with guns smashing the place to bits day after day, night after night. A series of night attacks so the Christians couldn't rest, drums, cymbals, real sort of psychological onslaught on the place.
Surların önüne yerleştirilmiş olan toplar gece gündüz sürekli şekilde ateşleniyordu ve ortalık adeta mahşer yerine dönmüştü. Bu topların büyük bir kısmı buradaki gibi gülleler atıyordu ama asıl büyük top 600 kilogram ağırlığında, bunun adeta 3 katı büyüklüğünde bir gülle atmıştı ve bu gülleler İstanbul surlarını adeta yerle bir etmişti ve büyük bir heyecana sebep olmuştu.
The Christian defenders could try and repair the damage. I mean, every so often they would put barrels of earth there, wood, rubble blocking the gaps. But ultimately, you can repair things so many times, but there is an end point.
...28 Mayıs akşamı artık Osmanlı ordusu bütün hazırlıklarını tamamlamış durumdaydı. Ve II. Mehmet kumandanlarına ertesi günü son hücumun yapılacağını bildirmişti. II. Mehmet ordusunu 3 bölüme ayırdı. İlk hücum sırasında Azap askerleri, yaya askerler saldırdılar. Ve tabii onlar önemli ölçüde kayıp verdiler. Bu ilk grup eridikten sonra hemen arkasından ikinci dalga geldi. Bu ikinci dalganın gelişiyle birlikte artık surlardaki bu savunma zinciri zayıflamaya başladı, çökmeye başladı. Ve bu şekilde son darbeyi vurmak üzere Yeniçeri grupları artık surların önüne doğru geldiler ve sur arasında çarpışmalar yoğun bir şekilde başladı.
Final onslaught comes. The Christians defend the walls bravely time after time. The Genoese commander, their great talismanic figure, is wounded in the arm. This is a disaster because he goes to seek help, but it's misinterpreted. They think he's running away. And this causes the whole stretch of defenders along this wall to lose heart. That really is the turning point. The Ottomans get a great hold on the wall, dam is burst, and they plunge into the city.
Triumphant, Mehmet the Conqueror was now Sultan of a new Ottoman Empire. To set the seal on his victory, Mehmet headed straight to the spiritual heart of the old Byzantine city. to claim an ancient Christian throne. The Hagia Sophia, meaning the Church of Holy Wisdom. This was the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years.
When he walked in here, Mehmet must have known that he'd achieved his ultimate ambition. He'd smashed the Byzantine Empire. This place was the spiritual heartland of Byzantium. It's the place where emperors were crowned, and now it was his. Years of struggle were over. He had triumphed.
After the conquest, Mehmet's troops looted the city, starting to strip the Hagia Sophia of its precious icons and relics.
Must have been complete chaos when Mehmet came in here just after the conquest. The place would have been a wreck. Yet it was still this wonderful, wonderful structure. And when he came in here, he saw a man hacking up the floor, and he said, well, what are you doing? And the man said, well, I'm doing it for the faith. Mehmet was furious. I mean, he said, look, I told you to keep the structure of the place intact. I want this building for myself, for the Ottomans and for Islam.
Mehmet had no intention of destroying the Hagia Sophia. He planned to adapt it. As a symbol of the arrival of the Ottomans, he converted the Hagia Sophia into an Ottoman mosque.
Mehmet changed the Hagia Sophia by stamping an Islamic identity on it. It had been a Christian power station, and now he really needed to erase that as much as he possibly could.
Mehmet installed a minbar from which the imam would deliver sermons. And in the apse, where the Christian altar used to stand, he built a mihrab pointing towards Mecca. Walking through the Hagia Sophia's corridors today is like walking back in time. The worn flagstones and dense brickwork date back over 1,500 years. Today, there are still visible remains of Hagia Sophia's lustrous mosaics, an unmistakable symbol of its Christian origins. But representational imagery such as this was forbidden in Islamic law, and all the mosaics were whitewashed. In laying claim to this magnificent structure, Mehmet could assert the power and authority of the Ottomans over Byzantine civilization. The Hagia Sophia's 4 minarets were added over the course of Ottoman rule. Today, they stand as a reminder of the moment the Ottomans took control and created a great new city. Buondelmonti's map from 1422 is the only surviving map that shows Byzantine Constantinople before the Ottoman conquest. The small details in this map, first compiled by geographer Piri Reis just 70 years after the conquest, reveals a transition. Mehmet radically altered the city with the symbols of Ottoman Islam. He gave orders to his pashas to build baths, mosques, and madrasas. From this moment on, the city became known as Istanbul. But the Ottomans were not going to stop here. As well as making the mark of Islam in this ancient city, Mehmet had a vision of a great empire, and one way to drive empire building was commerce. To promote economic growth, Mehmet maintained Byzantine trading links and encouraged the international traders of Renaissance Europe to return to business as usual. It's early morning at the Grand Bazaar, the largest and oldest market of its kind in the world. Shopkeepers prepare for business. And at the center lies a clue to its Ottoman beginnings. Based around the original Byzantine trading street, Mehmet founded the Old Bedistan in 1461. Its labyrinthine vaults and domed ceilings made it a fortress for trade.
The Bedistan is a strongly walled, steel-doored, square central marketplace where valuable items, silks, jewels, gold, are marketed. The idea is that at night it becomes a veritable bank, if you will. But it's also a bank where during the day business is carried out.
These doors have opened every day for almost 600 years. Over the life of the empire, the covered bazaar expanded to its current size. Today, the biggest market in the world, with 5,000 shops. These well-worn streets see 250,000 visitors every day. And today's Turkish traders still sell many of the same goods that drew travelers and merchants from all over the world into the Ottoman marketplace.
Eskiden burada tüccarın %50'si sarrafiye üzerine çalışırlardı. Eski Osmanlı mallarını alıp satarlardı. Halı, kilim, elmas, pırlanta, takı, beykoz malları alıp satılırdı.
Altın bizim adetlerimize göre, örfümüze göre çok önemli şeydir. Yani takı olmadan insanlar kendini güvencede hissetmezler ve gelin gitmezler. Onun için önemli bir olay. Mutlaka takı olarak, güvence olarak altın isterler.
Atalarımızın bize bıraktığı çok güzel miras olan Kapalı Çarşı'nın içinde çok güzel bir mekanımız var. Atmosferi, tabii mistik bir havası var. Gelen herkesin ilgisini çekiyor.
O güzel bir hissi, onun kokusunu aldığın müddetçe o kokuyu bırakıp da bir yere gidemiyordun. Ölünceye kadar burada kalıyorsun.
Today, no matter where we go in the world, we're surrounded by malls. And that mall, in a way, is an extension of this concept of the covered bazaar.
Just as the Ottoman Bazaar and the population of Istanbul begin a phase of exponential growth, Mehmet's empire enters its fastest growing phase. The Ottomans move eastward, taking over Turkic beyliks in the last areas of Byzantine resistance leading to their complete domination of Anatolia. And they also moved north, taking Serbia, Greece, Romania, and the Ukraine. As the Ottoman Empire grew in size and power, it spread its control further over Europe. But this flourishing empire was closely regulated and administered from a central point, Istanbul. So to consolidate his newfound power, Mehmet began building a new Ottoman palace. It was named Topkapı, and he chose an extremely important location. The site was the ancient Acropolis of Byzantium. Set upon the highest ground in the city, Topkapı Palace is shaded from the bustle of the city by woodland, extending all the way down to the Bosphorus shore. The basic layout of this new royal residence was established in Mehmet's time. Over centuries of Ottoman rule, the Topkapı complex became the byword for opulence, as later sultans enhanced its elaborate, ornate chambers and pavilions. Topkapı Palace is the expression of Mehmet's desire to create a centralized empire which would equal its European counterparts, even rival the legacy of the Roman Empire.
After taking Constantinople, this is where Mehmet pulled his new empire together. He was a military hero, conquering new lands. This gives him enormous prestige and clout. I mean, now the Ottoman Empire is a global empire in the sense of the globe in that period, and he could make great claims as to who he was. I, Mehmet, son of Murat, son of Mehmet, ruler of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, Rumelia and Anatolia, ruler of this, that, and that, and they got to add more conquests. They saw themselves as commanders of many old empires and regions. I think we could say he was a 360-degree sultan in the sense that the world around him needed to pay attention to him.
Sultan Mehmet tüm kadim gelenekleri şahsında birleştirmeye çalışan bir sultan olarak görüyor kendini. Eski Türk tarihini, eski İran tarihini, eski Arap tarihini, eski Yunan tarihini ve Roma tarihini şahsında birleştiren bir role soyunmuş vaziyette.
In Western eyes, Mehmet was the terror of the world. But as well as being a successful military leader, Mehmet was also a ruler of the Renaissance, primed to negotiate the Eastern and Western cultural horizons of his new empire. At Topkapı Palace, he created a sophisticated machine for government. He gathered the most highly skilled people in the empire and brought them to the palace to form a new Ottoman elite.
This is where the Sultan lived. It's very quiet right now as you look around. It looks very pastoral, but you have to imagine it full of people, quiet, disciplined, walking in the prescribed way, but rather full of people. Who were those people? They were the Sultan's personal servants, but perhaps more importantly, this third courtyard was something like a royal academy for training the Sultan's officers.
These officers were the Sultan's personal servants and advisors. But they were not the traditional Muslim advisors of his forefathers. They were a Christian-born intelligentsia. Selected from within the Ottoman territories, these Christian servants, or kul, were converted to Islam and trained the Ottoman way.
The ones who did very well would be chosen for the Sultan's own private room. The best would acquire titles like the Sultan's linen bearer, the Sultan's stirrup holder. And these titles are very important political titles, but they are service titles.
This was an Ottoman meritocracy. Being trained to serve in Mehmet's palace chambers could lead all the way to the top of the Ottoman political hierarchy. This is where Mehmet pulled the bureaucracy of his empire together. Here, he ran his centralized state. The Ottoman bureaucracy would meet at the Imperial Council.
This is really the seat of Ottoman government. Here is where the major decisions taken by the Sultanate were discussed and decided. They discussed military policy, foreign affairs. They were also responsible for the smooth running of the empire, which meant that they were constantly having information coming in from the provinces and responding to questions from their officials. So there was quite a flow of information.
Over 400 years ago, the head of the Chancery, the leading judges and the ministers of the Treasury would have gathered in this room, led by the Sultan's most powerful official, his Grand Vizier. Here, Sultan Mehmet II issued the first Ottoman imperial law code. Delegates, princes and diplomats from the West and the East were received in this room by the Ottoman elite. And most remarkably, even the lowliest Ottoman subject had the right to pass through the palace gates for an audience with the Sultan.
Ordinary people had the right to come to Istanbul and submit a petition to the Sultan. In fact, there's a story that has to do with the existence of this window up here. The story is about Mehmet the Conqueror, who would sit with his council, deliberating affairs and making decisions. And this alleged peasant comes in, and he's got his petition, and he says, "Which one of you is the Sultan?" Which, of course, insulted the Sultan. So the story goes that the Sultan gradually withdrew himself from council deliberations, but he had this room constructed up here. There's a small room behind this grill. And the Sultan would sometimes come, sometimes not come. The council would never know when he was going to be there. The point being that he was always scrutinizing the correctness of their deliberations.
But this was not only a regime that gave men a chance to prosper inside Topkapı. Inside the palace was another private training ground, exclusively for women. The harem.
The women in the harem, at all stages, were recruited like the men who were serving the Sultan as janissaries, as famous pashas. They all are Christian in origin. They may come in as prisoners of war. They may come in on the slave market, or they may come in as gifts. They're being taught cultural skills, how to converse politely. Some of them are expert musicians, poets. They perform. So it is a place where women are being trained for service to the dynasty.
Traditionally, the image of the Ottoman harem is one of pleasure and seduction. But as the harem expanded within Topkapı Palace, it brought women into the heart of government. Originally from places like Bulgaria, Georgia, and Macedonia, the women of the harem had converted to Islam. And through bearing the Sultan's son, some harem women were responsible for the political training of successors to the Ottoman Sultanate. Others became part of the Ottoman political arena by marrying the male trainees in the palace.
What they often did was to marry a graduate, if you want to say, of the female harem, so to speak, to the male side of the palace training. And in that way, it was clever of the dynasty. They had a kind of a satellite household. Woman is from the palace, man is from the palace.
Mehmet's circle drew together the culture of East and West. In his court, he kept Persian poets, Arab and Greek astronomers, Italian scholars and artists. This acceptance of diversity extended far beyond the palace. The Ottoman heartland acted as a bridge between Europe and Asia. Many of the people the Ottomans had conquered were non-Muslim. Although Sharia was the law of the land, the Ottoman system didn't impose Islamic culture upon the empire's Christian, Jewish, and other minority communities. Instead, Mehmet codified a system that would enable him to successfully manage one of the largest empires on earth. It was called the Millet system. It organized Ottoman subjects together by faith into different millets, or nations. At the Ottoman State Archives, there is detailed evidence on how the system worked in practice. This is one of the largest archives in the world. Its millions of documents reveal how Mehmet's administration recorded information about every person in their territories in exact detail. And there's one particular case that highlights the differences between the European West and the Ottomans. In 1492, the Sephardic Jews were being expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. The majority of them found a refuge in the Ottoman Empire. These meticulous documents list the names of the thousands of people that settled in Ottoman cities.
Bu gördüğümüz tapu defterindeki bu belge örneğin Musevilerin özellikle İspanya'dan ve Portekiz'den gelen Musevilerin Osmanlı İmparatorluğu'nun değişik yerlerinde bu arada Edirne gelişlerini belgeleyen bir tahrirdir. O zaman mahalle mahalle aile reisleri başta olmak üzere haneler tespit edilir. Onların isimleri, ailede kaç kişi olduğu, gelirleri. Bu bir yerde de bir vergi tahrir defteri mahiyetine geçer. Fakat bizim bugünlerde arşiv olarak çok değerli. Bu kadar ayrıntılı tutmak gerçekten insanı hislendiren bir olay.
This shows how waves of Jewish refugees integrated into the empire.
Gerçekten tarihin aydınlık geçmişinde bir gezinti yaptığımı hissediyorum. Belki de atalarımın ismini de vardır burada. Çünkü biz de Edirne kökenliyiz ve tesadüfen bu belge de Edirne'yi gösteriyor. Tabii bir de şunu kabul edelim. Bu da eski Türkçe yazılmış olan bu isimler kendilerine yabancı olan Yahudi isimlerini zaman zaman çözmekte veyahut aynen nakletmekte zorluk çekilmiştir. Mesela Hayim diye bir isim görüyorum. Buralarda işte Salomon veya Soliman, işte Süleyman diye ama Salomon olması lazım. Samuel diye bir isim görüyorum. Zaten bu isimlerin büyük bir kısmı, bu Yahudi isimleri Tevrat'tan alınmıştır ve aileden aileye geçmiş. Ancak son zamanlarda genel eğilime uyarak oturulan ülkenin ne bileyim havasında ulusallaştırılmıştır veya yerelleştirilmiştir.
Under the Millet system, minority communities had comparative social and religious freedom, so long as they kept to the rules and paid their taxes. The Millet system didn't give the empire's non-Muslim community complete equality, but it allowed the Ottomans to maintain a stable and peaceful empire in which trade could flourish. In ports like Bursa, trade was the lifeline of the city. And in great fortified marketplaces or hams, like Kozahan, 500 years ago there were thriving communities of Jews, Christians, Greeks, and Armenians.
We see that there were Muslim merchants, but they were often in business with Jewish merchants. They were often in business with former Byzantines. So one certainly doesn't get the aspect, the feeling in any way that trade and commerce in any way was limited by one's religion or anything like that.
With its mix of central regulation and comparative religious and social freedom, the Ottoman system allowed trade to develop within the empire. But it also attracted merchants from outside the empire. In Renaissance Europe, there was growing demand for exotic Ottoman products. In fact, Italian city-states like Venice were entirely dependent on trade in Ottoman dominions. They relied on the Ottomans for luxuries like spices, leather, and textiles. This Turkish connection was so vital that even today its legacy can be seen here in Venice. Known as the Fondaco dei Turci, this grand building served as home, warehouse, and market for all the Turkish traders living in Venice. A constant flow of merchants carried goods between Venice and port cities like Bursa.
The Italians brought wool, which they marketed in Hans just like this. And with the profits from the sale of that, they bought raw silk, which in turn they exported back to Italy. We have records from an Italian merchant, Francisco de Meringhi, who relates how he sold and made 1%, 1.5% on these sales. So, I mean, it was clearly a very complex market economy, even at the beginning of the 15th century.
It was this trade with places like Venice that built Bursa into a great city and fueled the expansion of the empire. The Ottoman dynasty cast its shade further and further around the world. Their unrivaled military strength, economic riches, and territorial expanse made Sultan Suleiman one of the world's most powerful rulers. In the 16th century, the empire expanded across 3 continents. The Ottomans controlled much of Western Asia, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe. Because their principles and practices were not tied to any one territory, the Ottomans were able to conquer and control a huge and complex empire.
we see case after case where when the Ottomans decided to move against a territory, that initially they proffer an offer. Surrender, and everything will stay the same. And one of the things that they followed very carefully is a policy that we call istimalet, goodwill, good treatment. So when the Ottomans come, they bring a kind of Pax Ottomanica, a kind of Ottoman peace. That kind of good treatment must have been a major factor in how the system was readily accepted. And that, of course, is an important part, I think, of their success.
But while Suleiman could claim that peace reigned within his empire, he brought war to those lands that refused his rule. From Mecca in the east to Rome in the west, Suleiman's ambition was to unite the world under his sovereignty. Now he pushed westward. Virtually invincible, the Ottoman elite troops, the Janissaries, were the vanguard of the largest army in Europe. At the Battle of the Mohacs in 1526, victorious Sultan Suleiman forged new frontiers into Hungary. 3 years later, the 300,000-strong Ottoman war machine pushed their way to the gates of Vienna. Shockwaves ran throughout Christian Europe. Total Ottoman domination seemed imminent. The dynasty that had risen in Anatolia had spread its influence far across the world. The empire had begun with a tiny independent kingdom just over 200 years earlier. But from this simple start, it had found a formula for success by using conquest, trade, and promoting the most talented people it could muster. It now stood on the brink of world power.